Good evening and welcome to the Strand. I'm Christina Foxley and I'm so excited to welcome Tony Fletcher and Jim Fouratt here tonight to discuss Tony Fletcher's book, All Hopped Up and Ready to Go, Music from the Streets of New York, 1927 through 1977. Tony Fletcher is a music journalist best known for his biographies of drummer Keith Moon and the band REM. He founded the music magazine Jamming, and his work has appeared in Newsday, Spin, and the New Musical Express. In All Hopped Up and Ready to Go, Music from the Streets of New York, 1927 through 1977, Fletcher takes us through bebop, the Latin music scene, the folk revival, glitter music, disco, punk, and hip-hop as they emerge from the neighborhood streets of Harlem, the East and West Villages, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens. As Booklist says, anyone interested in popular music and the rich cultural heritage of New York, indeed of all of the U.S., should read this book. Jim Fouratt is a journalist and activist. He was one of the founders of the Gay Liberation Front in New York. He is the person most responsible for the seminal Central Park Be-In of 1967 and participated in the infamous Stonewall riots of 1969. In addition, he is the former proprietor of the great 80s nightclub, Danceteria. Following their discussion, Tony and Jim would be happy to take your questions. We'll be walking around with this microphone, so please wait for this before you speak. They'll then sign copies of the book for you, which you can purchase downstairs on your way out of the store. Please join me in welcoming Musicophiles, Tony Fletcher, and Jim Fouratt to the Strand.
Thanks very much. It's a thrill to be here. It's a thrill to have a whole lot of people in front of us. I'm equally thrilled to have Jim Fouratt alongside me. I should probably say first up that Jim was one of the first people I met when I came to New York City. Somebody I think knew both of us and thought that we should meet. And it obviously made sense because we're still friends over 20, or it'd be about 21, 22 years ago that I met you, Jim. And Jim was extremely active in the whole New York City politics, music, culture scene then. He remains that way. And when I came to writing this book, I found out that he had been doing so more than 20 years before I came to New York City. If ever anybody has been on the ground in the midst of it all, it's this man alongside me. A little bit of I'm going to do a little bit of a preamble about the book, and then I'm going to read a couple of sections that kind of refer to Jim, and then we'll just start a discussion that I know is going to be easily take up our time, so I don't want to waste too much time here. The first section I'm going to the preamble about the book. As Christina just said, I've written biographies of particular artists. I lived in New York City for the best part of 20 years. I'm one of those people that set foot in New York City one day and said, I have to live here. It's a common story in the book amongst a lot of immigrants to New York City. It just has a magnetic pull on a lot of us, and I spent 18 months figuring out how to live here. I managed to make it work. I managed to make it work in the long term. I no longer live in the city. I followed a very popular kind of standard, almost exodus up to the Woodstock area. A lot of people I interviewed for the book live up there now. That made it a little bit easier when I was in the closing stages. And along the way, I felt that I really realized just how many music scenes had been born in New York City. And if you couldn't claim they'd been born here, like maybe, obviously jazz, you couldn't claim it had been born here. You could certainly claim it became a mainstay, not just because New York City is a big city or a capital city, but the culture just seems to be here. So many different scenes, come to the end of the book, you cannot argue that punk, disco, and hip-hop all had their births in New York City. It really becomes like an infallible argument there, and so many other things in between, from the Latin, Afro-Latin jazz through the urban folk music, the whole events of the Lower East Side in the 60s, the mambo, the vocal groups, which I found a really interesting story, the vocal groups of the 50s and the 40s before that. So I try to write the book in the sense that each chapter is about a culture and a genre and a neighborhood. You don't always get all three of them in one chapter, but I try my best. And to go with that, I should get this plug in now. If you go to my website, which is listed on the back cover and in the introduction, it's ijamming.net. I've been putting up MP3 playlists for each chapter and Google Maps as well. And the playlists are just 30-second samples through Amazon, and then the Google Maps. And they really kind of help show the cluster in each particular chapter, how people were just like clustered around a particular area. And that part of it's kind of fun. And similarly, you can hear some of the music, which I think some people would like to do. Not all. I was on Soundcheck today, and we played a track by the Ravens, who are really, really important. And John Schaefer hadn't heard it before, and this is a guy who just knows everything about music, and it just shows how much music there still is for all of us to hear. And I came across a lot of it doing this book. I won't pretend that I knew everything about every chapter going into it. A part of it was the learning, the fun of learning on my part as well. I'm going to read a little bit from a chapter called All Tomorrow's Parties. It will concern the area around here and the person to my right. The chapter All Tomorrow's Parties is set in the mid-60s. It's really about the Lower East Side morphing into something called the East Village and the politics that accompanied that. Hippies hit the New York mainstream in a big way that Easter Sunday, March 26. That would be 1967, right? When 10,000 of them gathered in Central Park's Sheep Meadow for a be-in. The peaceful celebration was organized in part by Paul Williams, editor of the new music magazine Crawdaddy, and by Jim Fouratt, a young actor and gay rights campaigner who described the event as an affirmation of love and happiness. Unlike its San Francisco forerunner, the Central Park be-in was structured to have no structure. No stage, no performers, no leaders, just thousands of people creating their own entertainment, establishing their own good vibe. By those standards, it triumphed, and the scene appeared to flourish. During May and June, an estimated 2,000 hippies moved into the tenement buildings surrounding Tompkins Square Park. Local landlords delighted in the sudden popularity afforded the neighborhood, doubling the rents on their dilapidated apartments. Long-term business owners also welcomed the initial influx of suburban white youth, many of whom brought their savings with them for the summer of love. The original beach-turned hippies were more ambivalent. Although they welcomed all new constituents to their counterculture, they were less enamored with the public drug use that invited police pressure, the circus street performances that attracted tourists previously confined to Greenwich Village, and the ever-increasing number of runaways who, as in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, showed up penniless and clueless, expecting the resident hippies to take care of them. The predominantly Puerto Rican populations of Avenue C and D, meanwhile, a largely forgotten neighborhood, blighted by genuine poverty and urban decay, looked with disdain upon the new arrivals in their brightly colored garbs, waxing spiritual niceties while downing large quantities of mind-altering drugs, and yet expecting society to catch them when they fell. Racial tensions and petty crime increased in the neighborhood through 1967. Jim McCarthy of the Gods, that's a band I wrote about in this area, was held up 3 times on his home block, 7th Street, between Avenue C and D, that year alone. Matters first came to a head on Memorial Day when a license was granted for a Tompkins Square Park concert on condition the crowd confine itself to the bandshell. When hippies spilled onto a surrounding grassy picnic area, the police moved in to clear them with a display of brute force that harked back to the riot of 1874, guaranteeing a mutual antagonism that would carry over into future generations of East Village others. Though a backtracking Parks Commissioner immediately yanked the double entendre sign, "Keep off the grass," from that corner of the park and replaced it with the comically outdated Troubadour area, the incident only served to aggravate the indigenous youth. A concert a few days later was broken up by a Puerto Rican gang. By the fall, pressure from the police and his landlord had forced Ed Sanders, that's Ed Sanders of the Fugs, to reclaim the Peace-Eye crash pad from Groovy and Friends and return it to bookstore status. Basically, Ed Sanders had opened a bookstore called Peace-Eye, but then his work with the Fugs had gotten him so busy he'd handed it over to a character called Groovy, who turned it into a crash pad for newly arrived hippies. On the night of October the 8th, Groovy was photographed with a young girl in a sleeping bag on the street outside the local head shop, Psychedelicatessen, on Avenue A and 10th Street. Hours later, the couple were discovered lying naked on the floor in a boiler room or basement just a block away on Avenue B, their heads beaten to a pulp with furnace bricks. The Groovy murders, as they were called, dominated the following day's front pages. 2 young drifters were eventually arrested and convicted for the murders, though their motives were left unexplained. The media already knew the male victim as James Hutchinson, a petty thief and former gang member from Rhode Island who'd gone on to become possibly the most media-savvy street hippie in the East Village. His only rival was medieval-clad Galahad, with whom he had once hosted a crash pad. But in his murdered partner, they discovered the real stuff of headlines, an instant poster child for what was quickly labelled the generation gap. Hailing from a wealthy family in Greenwich, Connecticut, 18-year-old Linda Fitzpatrick had just finished 4 years of private prep school. It turned out she had successfully convinced her parents that she was gainfully employed, designing posters in the hippie culture, even as she drifted from the East Village to Haight-Ashbury and back again, gravitating from LSD to speed in the process, sleeping in